Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the strangest chapters in modern history, the rise and fall of mephedrone, better known to its friends and very concerned parents as Meow Meow. That's right, a story so bizarre it makes bath salts look like Epsom salts and turns the average night out into a cautionary tale featuring glow sticks, legal loopholes, and one or two regrettable dance moves. And since this is our brand new channel, before you settle in, maybe take a second to hit like and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what you find here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for that white noise, and nestle down with your favorite blanket. Get comfortable because you're about to experience a tale that's equal parts chemical, comical, and frankly, catastrophic. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it felt like to live in an era where legal highs were just a mouse click away? Did you ever question why your cousin spent all of 2009 chewing his own sleeve at an underwhelming rave? Or how a humble white powder could go from obscure plant fertilizer to the headline-grabbing, headline-confusing party drug of a generation? And did anyone really know what they were buying? Or was everyone just pretending not to care? Was research chemical ever a real job? Or just something people said to their credit card companies? And now, congratulations. You've just woken up somewhere between a London squat, a suburban kitchen rave, and a BBC news segment where everyone seems equally baffled. It's the late 2000s, your phone flips open, Facebook is still cool, and your night is about to get a little too interesting. Long before it hit the clubs, mephedrone was quietly minding its own business, growing plants, living a humble life in obscure chemistry catalogs. No one suspected that the world's next notorious party drug was lurking, in bags labeled not for human consumption, waiting for its debut on the main stage of public panic. Let's set the scene. It's the early 2000s, and if you were a bored chemist or an extremely optimistic gardener, you might have stumbled across mephedrone. That's 4-methylmethcathinone if you're showing off at parties. Officially, it was designed for keeping your begonias looking their best, because apparently even plants need stimulants when the days get long. In practice, though, mephedrone was less about horticultural heroics and more about being an answer to a question nobody meant to ask. What if we could order a good time straight from the internet? If you'd browsed the right, or very wrong, corner of the web, you would have found it sold under a glorious variety of names. Plant food, bath salts, research chemical, or, for those in the know, Meow Meow. Why Meow Meow? No one's quite sure. Maybe because, like a caffeinated cat, it made people jittery, unpredictable, and prone to wide-eyed stares at inanimate objects. Or maybe it's just what happens when you let marketing interns name drugs on a Friday afternoon. At first, mephedrone's world was quiet. Just a handful of hobbyists and amateur chemists passing around chemical formulas on message boards with names like Blue Light and the Shady Greenhouse. The language was clinical, the packaging was discreet, and the sales pitch was always the same. Absolutely not for human consumption. Wink, nod. Please don't actually eat this, but if you do, tell us what happens, because we're dying to know. Of course, it didn't stay innocent for long. Humans, as it turns out, are deeply committed to two things: finding new ways to feel good and completely ignoring safety labels. And so, the first wave of curious experimenters did what people have always done when faced with a mysterious white powder. They tested it on themselves. Sometimes in the name of science, sometimes in the name of boredom, and usually in the name of a Friday night with nothing better to do. Imagine you're one of the first. You click through a sketchy website, spend $20 on plant food, and a few days later, a suspiciously anonymous envelope arrives at your door. You squint at the packet, sniff it, of course, and wonder if this is the beginning of an exciting new era or just a new chapter in questionable life choices. Spoiler, it's both. The effect was, well, let's call it memorable. Reports began filtering in. Euphoria, energy, the sudden urge to rearrange all your furniture at 3 a.m. while discussing philosophy with your own reflection. Word spread quickly because nothing travels faster than news of a drug that's cheap, legal, and available with free shipping. And just like that, mephedrone stepped out from the shadows of chemistry forums and into the sticky-floored clubs and living rooms of Europe. Suddenly, every party had its own amateur chemist, and every after-party was a symposium on the pros and cons of this new legal stuff. It was cheaper than cocaine, easier to find than MDMA, and, at least for a moment, endorsed by that most powerful of forces, plausible deniability. No, officer, it's for my azaleas. But as demand exploded, so did the questions. Where did it come from? Who was making it? And did anyone actually have any azaleas? Most of it came from makeshift labs in China and Eastern Europe, where manufacturers churned out batches by the ton, slapping on safety warnings that would make a lawyer weep. Quality control? Let's just say if you were hoping for the artisanal, small batch experience, you were in the wrong corner of the drug market. By 2008, mephedrone's innocent plant food disguise was starting to slip. Customs officials, doctors, and a small but growing legion of concerned parents began to ask why so many houseplants in Britain were suddenly so enthusiastic. Hospitals started to see the first casualties of the legal, high-craze, wide-eyed, dehydrated, and more than a little bit confused. In the end, the humble beginnings of Meow Meow were like most things in the early 2000s, a little bit tech, a little bit reckless, and destined to spiral way out of control. One day it was a bag of powder for your petunias. The next, it was front-page news and the unofficial mascot for a generation's brief, misguided flirtation with legal highs. And that, friends, is how you go from chemistry catalog footnote to party legend, one sketchy purchase at a time. Picture this. You're a scientist, or maybe just a very enthusiastic amateur with a credit card and no sense of self-preservation. Welcome to the wild west of legal highs, where almost anything could arrive in a vacuum-sealed bag, as long as you promised you were definitely not going to swallow it. It's the mid-2000s, and the world is on the cusp of a very strange new era. The internet isn't just for cat videos and slow-loading pictures anymore. No, it's a sprawling digital bazaar where you can order pizza, novelty socks, or, if you know the right forums, mystery powders promising euphoria, enlightenment, or a mild existential crisis. All you need is a shipping address, a willingness to trust the world's shadiest websites, and the ability to click "I agree" on some of the most absurd disclaimers ever written. In this new frontier, the research chemical, or RC, became the hipster's party drug. Forget cannabis, forget cocaine. If you weren't sampling 2-CB, trying to pronounce ethylphenidate, or debating whether that baggie actually contained what it claimed, were you even living? The rules were simple. Step 1. Buy a substance only chemists, crossword puzzle champions, and 3 guys on Reddit can spell. Step 2. Read the label, which inevitably said not for human consumption, but in a font so tiny and apologetic it practically winked at you. Step 3. Consume it anyway, preferably while live blogging, your experience for science and strangers. It was a community built on curiosity and, let's be honest, a total disregard for long-term consequences. Message boards and online collectives, names like Blue Light, Arrowwid, and the always ominous-sounding The Hive, became digital campfires where brave souls swapped trip reports and survival tips. There were spreadsheets tracking dosages, flavor notes that sounded like a deranged wine tasting, and a general sense that every experiment was just one typo away from disaster. Safety, if it existed, was a group project. I took 50 milligrams and saw God. Okay, I'll try 25 and report back. Of course, the appeal wasn't just the altered states of mind. It was the thrill of beating the system. You weren't just getting high, you were part of a new wave of pharmacological punk rock. No government could ban what hadn't technically been invented yet. By the time a country figured out what a particular substance was, the next batch, slightly tweaked, newly christened, and with even more incomprehensible chemical jargon, was already in the mail. This was a world with its own etiquette. If you ordered, say, methylone or mephedrone from a Chinese lab, you were supposed to act like a scientist at all times. Store your purchase in amber glass vials. Weigh it on a scale accurate to the milligram. Never, under any circumstances, admit you plan to snort the stuff off your phone screen at 3 a.m. next to your friend's pet iguana. That was simply not the spirit of scientific inquiry. The thing about the research chemical revolution was that it had all the optimism of the space race, but with more nosebleeds and fewer Nobel Prizes. There was genuine excitement. Each new compound was like finding a cheat code for reality, a way to experience colors more vividly, music more emotionally, and the inside of your own skull more intimately than ever before. If you were lucky, you had a pleasant evening and a good story for the forums. If you weren't, you might spend 3 hours believing you were a glass of orange juice, terrified that someone might tip you over. Meanwhile, governments and health agencies watched from the sidelines, clutching their pearls and drafting legislation that was out of date before the ink dried. Each ban was met with a new molecule. Each warning from the authorities only made the scene more appealing. If the grown-ups didn't want you to have it, it must be good, right? That logic has never failed, especially among people whose last meal was vending machine sushi at a 3-day rave. And so, the research chemical revolution rolled on, lawless, dazzling, and only occasionally catastrophic. It was a strange, fleeting moment when the boundaries between science, recreation, and sheer madness dissolved into one blur of online orders and vacuum-sealed hope. In the end, everyone involved was just searching for something. Maybe meaning, maybe enlightenment, or maybe just a way to make the week feel a little less ordinary. Whatever the answer, you could probably have it delivered by Thursday, tracked by a very confused postal worker, and shared in a trip report that began, so I definitely didn't need it. But it started innocently enough. Online forums began buzzing about a mysterious white powder that, depending on whom you asked, was either a spiritual awakening or a shortcut to chewing your own face off. Orders skyrocketed, and suddenly, Meow Meow was on every party shopping list, right between glow sticks and disappointment. Imagine it's 2008. You're sitting at a battered laptop, dial-up internet humming in the background, trawling through endless message boards filled with screen names like XX Euphoria, Pyrotex X, and Digital Shaman. Someone, somewhere, posts a glowing review of a substance called mephedrone. It's legal. It's fun. It's like MDMA and cocaine had a hyperactive baby that refuses to nap. Within hours, The thread is dozens of pages long. Half the posters want to try it, and the other half are desperately asking, "Is this safe?" Spoiler, no one really knew. But that never stopped anyone. Within days, a cottage industry exploded across the UK and Europe. Websites, often run out of the world's sketchiest spare bedrooms, popped up offering plant food, bath salts, or research chemicals with names that sounded like energy drinks for houseplants. Prices were laughably low. Next-day delivery was often faster than pizza. Some sites promised discreet packaging, as if the postal worker wasn't already suspicious of the sudden national boom in enthusiastic botanists. For the first time in history, buying a mind-bending substance was as easy as ordering socks and just as impersonal. No need for a shady alley or a whispered exchange in a grimy club bathroom. No, this was progress. This was 21st century self-destruction, tracked via shipping confirmation email and a deeply apologetic return policy. We regret to inform you that your parcel of legal happiness was seized by customs. Here's a coupon for 10% off your next order. Online, the buzz built into a roar. Every social media feed and forum post became a choose-your-own-adventure in harm reduction. Tried 150 grams, saw colors. Tried 300 grams, became colors. For every positive review, there was a horror story. Don't mix with vodka, or orange juice, or actually anything. But as with most things on the internet, the promise of a cheap, legal high drowned out warnings faster than you can say famous last words. The word spread from screen to street. People who'd never heard of cathinones or the finer points of neuropharmacology suddenly found themselves hosting kitchen table science experiments. Group chats were filled with logistics. Has yours arrived yet? Did you get the yellowish one or the white one? Do you still have teeth? Every night out became a half-baked pharmaceutical trial. I'm peaking. I'm tweaking. I think I'm allergic to the wallpaper. The first wave wasn't just about Meow Meow. It was about possibility. For the first time, regular people felt like they had cracked the code, outsmarted the system, and scored a brief but glorious victory over the man. Who needs a dealer? I've got Royal Mail, at least until the first shipment got lost, and someone's grandmother ended up very confused by a mysterious, powdery birthday surprise. Of course, the fun came with consequences. Within months, emergency rooms began seeing a new breed of patient, wide-eyed, jaw-clenching, and insisting they were totally fine, just a bit thirsty. Police departments were equally mystified. What do you mean it's legal? Became the question of the year, followed closely by, what's a cathinone? Local news reporters, delighted by the surge in dramatic content, warned of a legal high epidemic, usually accompanied by B-roll footage of glow sticks, vague stock footage of nightclubs, and at least one unfortunate shot of a confused house cat. If you were lucky, you just lost a night's sleep and a little dignity. If you weren't, you found yourself in a hospital trying to explain to a nurse why your hands wouldn't stop making jazz fingers. And if you were the entrepreneurial type, you were probably trying to figure out how to sell your own brand of Meow Meow, possibly called Happy Pet Plant Food, with a hand-drawn logo and a delivery policy that read, "No refunds, no questions, don't call us." The online boom changed everything. For a brief, surreal moment, the laws of economics and the laws of chemistry collided, resulting in a party scene that felt both futuristic and deeply medieval. The era of anonymous internet orders, amateur chemistry, and rampant optimism wouldn't last forever. But while it did, it was chaos, pure, unfiltered, bubble-wrapped, chaos. And to think, it all started with a simple forum post and a collective willingness to ignore every warning, label in the known universe. Unlike wine or cheese, mephedrone didn't come with a tasting note. What you got depended on which corner of the internet you trusted and how much you enjoyed playing chemical roulette with your nervous system. Let's set the mood. It's a Saturday night in 2009. Your living room is now a makeshift laboratory, and someone has just dumped a suspiciously unmarked baggie on the coffee table. The label says plant food, but you and your friends aren't discussing the pros and cons of soil pH. Instead, you're all peering at a pile of white powder, hoping it's the good stuff, and not, say, drywall dust, baking soda, or something scraped off a chemistry professor's regrets. Because here's the thing. Mephedrone was never just mephedrone. With no regulation, no oversight, and zero quality control, every purchase was a gamble worthy of a game show. Some batches glistened like fresh snow. Others were chunky, clumpy, or tinged a suspicious yellow. And everyone had a story about the really strong one, or the stuff that made you see through time. Testing? If you were lucky, someone had a $15 reagent kit from the internet. If you weren't, your purity test was based on which unlucky friend tried it first and lived to talk about it. Buying Meow Meow was less about trusting the supplier and more about trusting the universe. The more adventurous crowd loved to pretend they were pharmacological sommeliers. Ah, yes, this batch is earthy, with top notes of terror and a finish of existential dread. In reality, you were just as likely to get something cut with caffeine, lidocaine, or something less pleasant. The unofficial motto of the era, if it burns, it works. Adulteration wasn't just common, it was practically a rite of passage. Since most mephedrone was shipped in from overseas, often from enormous, undersupervised labs in China or Eastern Europe, it changed hands multiple times like an illicit game of telephone. Along the way, it might get stretched with sugars, random powders, or whatever was lying around the warehouse. Did you think you were getting a pure, single compound? Think again. You were lucky if your bag contained mostly the same family of chemicals as mephedrone, never mind actual purity. For every clean batch, there were urban legends about what people found in the bad ones. Some unlucky buyers opened a bag and found crystalline chunks that fizzed like pop rocks in water. Others ended up with off-white sludge, a distinctly fishy aroma, and a sudden desire to call their childhood dentist. There were stories of people who swore they received something entirely different, MDPV, methylone, or the always popular mystery stimulant. It was a chemical shell game where the rules changed every week, and the only certainty was uncertainty. The lack of consistency became a running joke. People would swap stories on forums. Last week's stuff made me dance for hours. This week's made me forget how to walk. In a strange way, the unpredictability was part of the thrill, a communal embrace of chaos, as if everyone agreed, let's roll the dice and see what kind of Tuesday we get on a Saturday night. The results could be comical or catastrophic. For some, a mild high and a story to tell. For others, anxiety, paranoia, or a trip to the emergency room. The spectrum of possible outcomes ranged from my teeth feel amazing to I'm never sleeping again to call an ambulance, but also, can someone feed my goldfish? And if something went wrong, good luck getting answers. You couldn't exactly email customer service. Hi, I tried your product and now I can hear colors, refund. In the background, a small but growing cadre of amateur harm reductionists did their best to warn people. They published guides, how to test your powder, how to recognize an imposter batch, how to spot the telltale signs that your party favor was 50% mystery ingredient. But even the most careful user was ultimately left with a nagging question. Was tonight's batch going to be euphoria, disaster, or both? The art of guesswork became a badge of honor. People swapped tips like wine enthusiasts at a tasting. The yellower it is, the weirder you feel. The clumpier, the stronger. No one really knew. And yet, everyone pressed on, because, as with all fads, the promise of the next best thing outweighed the common sense of waiting for lab results. So you took a chance, scooped a line, and crossed your fingers. In the end, the era of mephedrone was as much about trust as it was about chemistry. Trust in strangers, trust in luck, and trust in your body's ability to survive whatever was in the bag. History never tasted quite so uncertain. By 2008, Britain's club scene was ripe for something new. Cocaine was expensive, MDMA was unpredictable, and Meow Meow was the cheap legal alternative. The only problem? No one quite knew what it actually did, except make you dance like your rent depended on it. Picture it. Neon lights flickering over sticky dance floors, crowds packed tighter than a rush hour tube, and a general atmosphere of reckless optimism that only truly thrives on a Saturday night. The DJ is halfway through their third Ibiza anthem of the evening, and you, along with half the club, are riding a euphoric, jittery wave of mephedrone. You don't know whether you want to hug everyone in the building, redesign the club's lighting scheme, or explain the meaning of life to the person waiting in the loo queue. The answer is yes. This was the heyday of Meow Meow mania, a perfect storm of supply, demand, and just the right amount of collective denial. Clubbers were tired of second-rate pills and cocaine that tasted suspiciously of talcum powder. Into this vacuum swooped mephedrone, the miracle white powder promising a legal high with all the trimmings and none of the jail time. Dealers couldn't keep up with demand. Some stopped bothering, with code words. You didn't ask for Charlie or Mandy, you asked, in plain English, for Meow Meow. And you got it, in bulk, for a fraction of what you'd pay for a single round at the bar. Nobody really knew what a safe dose was. Recommendations ranged from just a bump to, I don't know, I took a teaspoon and now I can hear colors. The effect was immediate. Waves of energy, a burning desire to communicate with strangers, and the sudden conviction that the club's bathroom attendant was your new best friend. Everything was loud, bright, and meaningful. The music pulsed through your chest like a second heartbeat. The dance floor became both playground and battlefield, as people cycled between joyous flailing and dramatic hugs with people they'd only met that night. The unpredictable side effects only added to the chaos. For every moment of bliss, there was a crash lurking in the shadows, jaw clenching. The urge to endlessly chat about nonsense, and a thirst so intense it sent clubbers queuing for water like medieval peasants at a holy spring. If you were unlucky, you'd spend the last hour of the night staring at your own reflection in a bathroom mirror, quietly negotiating with your eyeballs. But the magic was in the shared experience. It was democratic. Anyone could join in, regardless of status or budget. Regulars mingled with first-timers. The only requirement was a willingness to embrace whatever happened next. "You're on Meow Meow too?" became the night's most common icebreaker, followed closely by, "Do you have any gum? And why are my hands doing that?" The club scene became a laboratory for Meow Meow culture. Every night was an experiment. What happens if you mix it with vodka? What if you don't? How many lines are too many? Spoiler, the answer was always fewer than you'd think. There were success stories, epic nights, new friendships, memories so vivid they glowed for weeks. But there were horror stories too, panic attacks, paranoia, friends who vanished to the smoking area and never came back. The club's lost and found was full of sunglasses, phone chargers, and dignity. The mainstream media, of course, had a field day. Tabloids published breathless exposés about Britain's legal high epidemic, complete with blurry nightclub photos and lurid quotes from self-proclaimed experts. One headline read, "Teenagers turn into zombies on party drug," which, if you've ever seen a club at closing time, wasn't entirely off base. Parents panicked, politicians blustered, and club owners quietly wondered if the coat check should start offering bottles of Lucozade. Through it all, Meow Meow held its strange, democratic grip. It made the club scene unpredictable and unforgettable, sometimes in good ways, sometimes not. But for a generation searching for connection, release, and a sense of shared euphoria, it was the perfect storm. A chemical shortcut to community, adventure, and a little bit of controlled chaos. And as dawn crept in and the dance floor emptied, the story was always the same. Wild highs, messy lows, and a lingering sense that the night, like Meow Meow itself, had been a strange, temporary miracle. Inside your brain, Meow Meow went full toddler in a candy store, flooding synapses, hijacking reward systems, and making sleep a distant, laughable memory. The result? Hours of euphoria, followed by days of regret, and a strong urge to talk to strangers about absolutely nothing. Let's get a little scientific, but don't worry, there won't be a test, and no one expects you to remember the periodic table at 2 a.m. Mephedrone is what chemists call a synthetic cathinone, which is a fancy way of saying a molecule that acts a bit like the active ingredient in kate, a plant chewed in East Africa for mild stimulation and a truly magnificent jaw workout. But mephedrone is about as similar to cat as a microwave burrito is to fine dining. Technically related, but one will leave you questioning all your life choices by morning. Once inside your body, mephedrone doesn't waste time with pleasantries. It quickly crosses the blood-brain barrier. Imagine a nightclub bouncer who's had a few too many, then jumps into action. Its primary targets? The big three: dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. These are your brain's chemical party planners, the ones responsible for happiness, excitement, love, the urge to buy novelty hats online, and, regrettably, the crash that follows. Mephedrone tells your neurons to start firing like they've just gotten a group text about free pizza. Dopamine surges through your reward pathways, convincing you that dancing until sunrise is both noble and necessary. Serotonin levels climb, leaving you with a sense of deep connection to everyone and everything, including your reflection in a sticky club bathroom mirror. Norepinephrine kicks in, and suddenly you have the energy of a caffeinated meerkat and the conversational skills of a game show host on double speed. This all sounds great if you ignore your cardiovascular system, which absolutely does not appreciate the sudden workload. Heart rate? Up. Blood pressure? Up. Sweating? You'll want to avoid silk. And if you're hoping for a good night's rest, think again. Mephedrone tosses sleep out the window, then dances on the windowsill for good measure. For many, a fun night out segued into hours of staring at the ceiling, composing epic texts to old friends, or rearranging the cutlery drawer at 4 a.m. because it just felt right. But the science isn't all giddy euphoria. Like every great party, there's a come down. As the drug clears your system, those surging neurotransmitters plummet. That means mood crashes, anxiety, irritability, and a lingering sense that you once had the secret to happiness, but left it somewhere in the smoking area. Many users describe the classic midweek blues, a few hours of ecstatic connection, followed by a day or two of exhaustion, and the creeping suspicion that you now hate all music, people, and most importantly, yourself. The body, meanwhile, is less than thrilled. Besides the rapid heartbeat, dry mouth, and occasional urge to chew through furniture, there are more worrying effects: jaw clenching, tremors, and that classic rave symptom, sweating like you're being interrogated by airport security. Your appetite? Non-existent. Your sense of thirst? Unquenchable. And don't even ask about the urge to keep going. Mephedrone, like its chemical cousins, is notorious for making just one more line sound both reasonable and responsible, which, in hindsight, it never is. Scientists are still piecing together the long-term effects. But even in the early days, there were warning signs. Reports trickled in of users feeling anxious, paranoid, or unable to sleep for days. Some experienced panic attacks, hallucinations, or a sudden fascination with conspiracy theories about the club DJ. There were cases of nosebleeds, chest pain, and, inevitably, hospital visits by people who swore they were just a little bit too enthusiastic about the science experiment. In the end, mephedrone was a master at tricking the brain. For a while, it convinced you that you were the life of the party, a philosopher, a dance floor legend, or all three at once. Then it took it all away, leaving you with sore legs, a head full of regrets, and an epic craving for both carbohydrates and forgiveness. So, the science lesson here? Meow Meow didn't just hijack your reward system, it left a little chaos in its wake. The highs were high, the lows were low, and the desire to narrate your life story to a stranger in the queue for the kebab shop was, at least for one night, completely irresistible. Enter the tabloids. Suddenly, every story was about teenagers gnawing furniture or turning into zombies. Meow Meow became the star of a moral panic, with headlines that were only outdone by the creative Photoshop skills of daytime television. It's a story as old as time, or at least as old as breakfast television. A new drug hits the streets, and within a week, every news anchor, tabloid columnist, and daytime talk show host is locked in a battle to see who can describe it in the most apocalyptic terms. Never mind that no one actually knows what mephedrone is, or how to pronounce it, because Meow Meow is just too fun to say. Somewhere between the morning weather and the latest celebrity scandal, viewers are treated to dramatic montages, stock footage of strobe-lit nightclubs, ominous shots of anonymous teenagers in hoodies, and grainy close-ups of baggies filled with mysterious white powder. But this was the era of, if it bleeds, it leads. In the absence of actual facts, the gaps were filled with imagination. It wasn't enough to say that Meow Meow kept people awake and chatty. Now, it was turning teens into hyperactive furniture chewers, giving them superhuman strength, and, in one especially creative segment, apparently causing spontaneous face melting. If you believed the headlines, half the youth population of Britain was about to be found gnawing on garden gnomes by sunrise. Parents panicked. Police held town hall meetings. School assemblies featured PowerPoints with titles like "Protect Yourself from Plant Food." Every newscast felt like a horror movie trailer. Could your child be next? Find out at 10. The message was clear. No one was safe, especially if you had a teenage child, a houseplant, or a fondness for shopping online. Meanwhile, Meow Meow sales soared because nothing sells quite like forbidden fruit, especially when it's delivered discreetly by the Royal Mail. Not to be outdone, politicians weighed in with grave expressions and stern promises to do something, preferably before the next news cycle. Legislative crackdowns were hastily proposed. New laws were drafted with the speed and attention to detail usually reserved for assembling flat-pack furniture at midnight. Each week, another headline: ban on Meow, Meow imminent. Police seize mountain of party drug. Local mom's warning after son spends 36 hours cleaning the bathroom. The more the media panicked, the more the myths multiplied. Urban legends grew faster than the real dangers. There were stories of teens who'd lost their minds after a single dose, students who developed superpowers, and, most implausible of all, reports that someone, somewhere, had written their entire dissertation in one night thanks to Meow Meow's brain-boosting powers. None of this was verified, but the details only got wilder with each retelling. Social media, for its part, fueled the fire. Viral Facebook posts warned of the drug that turns your nose into jelly, or the legal high that makes you crave garden soil. Someone inevitably started a rumor that mephedrone was originally designed as a veterinary tranquilizer for giraffes, because if there's one thing the internet loves, it's a story that gets stranger every time. You hear it. Meanwhile, YouTube filled up with reaction videos, most of which involved a lot of giggling, poorly lit bedrooms, and the occasional confession that, actually, nothing much happened except a lot of talking and a deep need for orange juice. As with every moral panic, the real risks got lost in the noise. There were genuine dangers, of course: bad batches, overdoses, panic attacks, and trips to the emergency room that weren't nearly as entertaining as the tabloids suggested. But nuance doesn't sell newspapers, and no one tunes in for a story about moderate side effects with responsible use. Instead, the narrative was all crisis, all the time. In the end, the Meow Meow panic was less about chemistry and more about the peculiar joy we take in collectively losing our minds every time something new comes along. It was part horror movie, part farce, and all proof that when it comes to drugs, teenagers, and a slow news week, reality is never quite wild enough. So, the myths flourished, the tabloids roared, and somewhere in the background, actual science quietly took notes, waiting for the dust to settle. Forget Breaking Bad. In the Meow Meow era, your average home chemist wore pajama pants, used a food scale, and could ruin both a batch of drugs and a perfectly good non-stick frying pan in the same afternoon. Picture it: a British suburb, 2009. Not a seedy underground lab with blue lights and growling security guards, but a cluttered kitchen full of mismatched mugs, last night's takeaway, and a faint but unmistakable chemical tang. This is the new frontier, where curiosity, ambition, and a complete disregard for property values collide. Here, the cook is someone who probably failed GCSE chemistry and now moonlights as a self-appointed scientist because they watched one YouTube tutorial and own a pair of safety goggles from Poundland. The setup? Nothing glamorous. A cheap blender, plastic buckets, and the aforementioned frying pan, now destined to smell of cat pee and regret forever. Ingredients arrive in unmarked bags, sourced from shadowy corners of the internet and labeled in code. Some are genuinely needed for the process. Some are just there for vibes. If you're lucky, you've also invested in a food scale precise enough to measure the weight of your conscience. If you're not, You're measuring out about half a teaspoon and hoping you're not about to invent a new urban legend. Safety? Let's just say the average home lab had about as much risk management as a medieval siege. Ventilation was often an open window, sometimes a fan balanced precariously on the hob. Gloves were optional, masks were for wimps, and "don't breathe this in" was advice given right after someone coughed up something alarming. Emergency plans ranged from throw it in the sink and run to blame it on the dog. Of course, there was a weird sense of camaraderie. Kitchen chemistry was a community activity like baking, but with more existential dread and far fewer cupcakes. People shared tips in online forums. Don't use metal utensils, never let it boil over, and the always ominous, "if it turns blue, you've gone too far." There was an unspoken agreement that no one really knew what they were doing, but everyone would pretend otherwise, right up until something exploded or the neighbors complained about the smell. The results varied wildly. Some batches turned out shockingly potent, sending users into 12-hour rants about the hidden meaning of disco balls. Others were duds. I did a whole line and just felt like cleaning my room. Every so often, someone managed to create a product so impure it left people with nosebleeds, rashes, or the sudden urge to never trust a friend who owns a mortar and pestle again. And let's not forget the kitchen casualties: melted Tupperware, scorched countertops, and one unfortunate incident involving a Pyrex jug, a misguided Bunsen burner, and a very angry cat. But despite the risks, the appeal was obvious. Making your own mephedrone was cheap, gave you bragging rights, and, most importantly, cut out the middleman. No need for awkward handshakes in pub toilets. You were your own supplier, chemist, and occasionally first responder. Plus, there was an undeniable thrill in the secrecy, drawing the blinds, swearing your housemates to silence, and feeling, just for a moment, like a protagonist in a discount crime thriller. Naturally, the authorities were not amused. Police forces across the UK soon found themselves responding to calls about strange smells and suspicious bubbling noises in otherwise respectable neighborhoods. Sometimes the evidence was obvious: bags of powder, chemical stains, or a kitchen that looked like a GCSE science experiment gone nuclear. Other times, it was subtler: unusually clean microwaves, lots of glassware, and people who suddenly became very interested in the boiling points of household chemicals. Despite the tabloid hysteria, most kitchen chemists were not criminal masterminds. They were just bored, adventurous, or trying to save a bit of cash. If anything, the entire era proved that with enough internet access, misplaced confidence, and complete disregard for home insurance, almost anyone could dabble in the world of amateur chemistry. Some even fancied themselves innovators, tweaking recipes, trading pro tips, and dreaming of one day being the first to discover the next big thing, hopefully without burning the house down. In the end, the home lab boom was both absurd and strangely inevitable, a chaotic chapter where DIY met DI, why did I do this? Kitchens became playgrounds for a generation who wanted a little excitement, a lot of escape, and perhaps, deep down, a story they'd never admit to their parents. And if you're still wondering why your frying pan smells funny, maybe, just maybe, you survived the age of kitchen chemistry. The loophole was simple. As long as you wrote "not for human" consumption, the authorities mostly shrugged. Dealers sold Meow Meow as bath salts, plant food, and, once, infamously, as pond cleaner, in the kind of marketing move that would haunt public health officials for years. It was the golden age of plausible deniability. You could walk into a head shop, make brief, awkward eye contact with the owner, and leave with a packet of mephedrone labeled with instructions for horticultural use only. Not a soul in the building thought anyone was actually fertilizing begonias, but the magic words were on the packaging, and that was enough. It was a retail performance, half comedy, half tragedy, where everyone involved pretended they'd never heard of a nightclub. Online, things were even more surreal. Retailers went to outlandish lengths to maintain the legal charade. Websites offered advice on how to optimally feed your plants or clean your pond, and included stern warnings. Under no circumstances should this product be ingested, snorted, or injected. This was usually followed by a wink, a nudge, and a list of user reviews detailing exactly how happy the plants were after a long weekend. The reason for all this theater was a peculiar gap in the law. At the time, governments around the world hadn't caught up to the chemistry. Mephedrone was a new molecule, technically unscheduled and unregulated. Existing drug laws covered the classics, cocaine, MDMA, amphetamines, but not this. It wasn't illegal to buy, sell, or possess mephedrone unless you made the fatal mistake of admitting you planned to enjoy it yourself. In that case, well, now you had a problem. Dealers became experts in creative writing. Each new batch came with an increasingly absurd disclaimer: for botanical research only. Do not use as a food additive. Keep away from children, pets, and anyone with common sense. The more preposterous the product, the more elaborate the legal shield. Some even printed novelty collector's item on their bags, as if mephedrone was destined to join a shelf alongside commemorative coins and plates with pictures of corgis. This legal twilight zone had hilarious consequences. Customs agents seized kilos of plant food but couldn't charge anyone, unless they could prove human consumption, which was easier said than done. Police found themselves raiding head shops only to be told, in the politest tones possible, that the bath salts on display were strictly for relaxing soaks, and definitely not for recreational use. Law enforcement's hands were tied in bureaucratic knots. The best they could do was shake their heads and warn, "Don't believe everything you read on the label." For users, the whole system became a game. You knew the rules. Don't talk about eating the product. Don't ask too many questions. And whatever you do, don't get caught mixing your plant food with a line of credit and a busy weekend. Even parents got in on the action, peering suspiciously at their teenagers' sudden interest in aquatic gardening. Is that new fertilizer for the goldfish, dear? Or should I be worried? Inevitably, politicians started to notice the absurdity. Newspapers ran stories about the epidemic of teenagers high on bath salts, and talk shows hosted panels of experts who seemed baffled by the difference between horticulture and hedonism. The pressure mounted for a ban. Lawmakers scrambled to draft new regulations, usually about 6 months behind the latest, not for human consumption chemical. But for a brief, wild period, the law simply couldn't keep up. Every time the government banned one compound, another would pop up, just a tweak of the molecule away from the last. Dealers got creative, marketing new blends with names that would make a professional botanist weep. The loophole was wide enough to drive a truckload of pond cleaner through, and the party raged on. In the end, the era of legal mephedrone was an accidental experiment in how far you can stretch a legal loophole before reality snaps back. It was comedy, tragedy, and farce all at once, proof that sometimes the only thing more creative than chemistry is the fine print on the packaging. And if you ever wondered why that random corner shop sold so much bath salt, now you know. It wasn't about cleanliness, it was about plausible deniability, and everyone was in on the joke. What started in Europe quickly went global. Reports flooded in from Australia, Israel, and the US, all equally unprepared for the strange mix of giddy energy and existential dread mephedrone delivered. For a brief, dazzling moment in the late 2000s, it seemed like Meow Meow was everywhere at once. You could almost plot the spread on a world map, watching as the bright spark of one country's club scene lit up another's, trailing rumors, memes, and baffled emergency room staff in its wake. Mephedrone had achieved the kind of international fame usually reserved for viral cat videos or disappointing reality TV contestants. It wasn't just the usual suspects in Europe, either. Australia caught wind of the legal high trend, and soon enough, stories emerged of partygoers mixing mephedrone into their drinks at music festivals, then regretting it as they tried to explain to a kangaroo why their heart was beating faster than techno. In Israel, newspapers published stern warnings about the new plant fertilizer fad, which, despite its agricultural branding, didn't seem to result in any healthier houseplants. Instead, it produced long nights of sweaty dancing, oversharing, and the occasional existential conversation with a traffic cone. Across the Atlantic, the United States entered the Meow Meow chat with a certain sense of inevitability. American head shops already specialized in selling anything the law hadn't explicitly banned, and mephedrone fit right in alongside novelty pipes, questionable incense, and a line of bath salts that definitely weren't for spa day. As always, the U.S. added a little extra drama. News reports screamed of dangerous new party drugs sweeping the nation, and local politicians promised to shut down rogue chemists before they could corrupt the youth, or, more realistically, the already corruptible. But what made Meow Meow's global takeover possible was the sheer efficiency of the internet. A new substance could show up in a forum thread in Manchester one day, and by the end of the week, it was being sampled in Melbourne, mixed in Miami, and dissected in Dusseldorf. It was globalization in real time, powered by group chats, trip report blogs, and occasionally a deeply confused customs agent holding a bag labeled "not for human consumption." Each new country faced the same cycle. First, curiosity, stories of a cheap, legal high that didn't require knowing a guy named Sketchy Dave. Then, a gold rush of entrepreneurs scrambling to import, repackage, and rebrand the powder into something you could plausibly explain to your grandma if she found it in your sock drawer. After that, panic, overblown headlines, government warnings, and heartfelt pleas from health officials who definitely hadn't read any of the forums, but had very strong opinions about bath products. What unified these disparate scenes was a sense of shared chaos. No matter where you were, the same questions echoed. Is this batch real? Is it safe? How can something legal feel this illegal? And why, oh why, does it taste like disappointment and regret? Nightclubs in London, rooftops in Tel Aviv, frat houses in Ohio, everywhere, the pattern repeated. Laughter, nerves, impulsive dancing, and the gradual, creeping suspicion that someone should probably call a doctor. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, Meow Meow's moment would pass. Sometimes the law caught up. Sometimes people simply moved on to the next novelty. But the stories lingered. Across continents, there are still tales of that one wild night. The powder that made you best friends with a stranger. Or the morning after walk of shame featuring sunglasses, silence, and the shared vow. Never again until next weekend. In the end, mephedrone's global run proved one thing. If there's a loophole to be found, humans will leap through it, sometimes all at once, sometimes while wearing glow sticks, and always in search of a good story. The party might end, but the legend lives on, echoing from one time zone to the next, reminding us that history isn't just written by the victors. Sometimes it's written by the exhausted, the exhilarated, and the eternally optimistic souls who just wanted to try something new, no matter how strange or how far from home. In the world of Meow Meow, moderation was a rumor. Everyone knew someone who'd intended to just try a little and wound up rearranging their entire furniture set at 4 a.m., convinced the carpet was plotting against them. Let's be honest, self-control and stimulants have never been the best of friends, and mephedrone was no exception. It started off with noble intentions, maybe just a small bump, a taste, a dip of the pinky finger. Let's see what all the fuss is about, someone would say, moments before embarking on a 12-hour odyssey through dehydration, jaw tension, and the sort of hyperactive introspection usually reserved for motivational posters. But with Meow Meow, lines had a way of multiplying. Just one, sure, but suddenly just one became just one more, and then somehow it was sunrise, and the kitchen bin was full of empty baggies and broken promises. The problem, as most users quickly discovered, was that mephedrone didn't just switch you on. It short-circuited your internal enough alarm. The first rush was so warm, so euphoric, so I am the king of dance and also philosophy, that the idea of stopping felt as absurd as saying no to more chips at a pub. You'd think, I'll do a little, then call it a night. 5 hours later, you're enthusiastically reorganizing your bookshelf by color, genre, and spiritual significance. The line between fun and fiasco was a moving target, constantly shifting with every just one more. Unlike alcohol or weed, there was no slow fade or gentle reminder from your body that it was bedtime. Instead, mephedrone whispered encouragement. You're still awake, you're still happy, why not a bit more? And because it wore the reassuring cloak of legality for a while, people felt emboldened. If it was still on sale in your local head shop, how bad could it really be? For some, dosage disasters meant hours of nervous energy and conversations about nothing with whoever happened to be awake, friends, houseplants, that weird neighbor who also seemed to be vacuuming at 5 a.m. But for others, it was a trip straight to panic town. The body sweats, the heart pounds, and the mind races through a greatest hits of irrational fears. You try to drink water, but discover your jaw no longer works for sipping. You check your pulse so often you consider updating your LinkedIn to self-trained cardiologist. Every club scene had its own legends. The guy who did so much mephedrone, he decided to mop the club bathroom, top to bottom, during peak hours. The girl who tried to phone her own cat to say she was running late. Or the group who started a new religion dedicated to the glow stick. All because they just couldn't stop. There were also, inevitably, the less funny stories when someone took too much, too fast, and found themselves hurtling through waves of anxiety, paranoia, and the kind of regret that only comes when you realize you still have to work tomorrow. Emergency rooms saw it all. Heart palpitations, panic attacks, teeth grinding so severe you could use it to sand furniture. How much did you take? The doctor would ask. The answer was always, I lost count. And yet, the cycle would repeat. Because mephedrone, like all stimulants, made yesterday's disasters seem like tomorrow's opportunities. I just need to pace myself. Users would swear, ignoring the obvious. In the land of Meow Meow, pacing was about as realistic as moderation at an all-you-can-eat dessert buffet. In the end, dosage disasters became a core part of the Meow Meow folklore, an inside joke and a cautionary tale. Proof that when it came to this particular party drug, self-restraint was the first casualty of the night. And as the sun rose on yet another night of just one more, everyone promised themselves, next time, they'd be smarter. Next time, they'd stick to just a little. But of course, next time always had other plans. As Facebook, YouTube, and Reddit exploded with trip reports, the legend of Meow Meow grew. Was it the next big thing, or a one-way ticket to dental disaster? Opinions varied, but everyone agreed. Someone should probably call their dealer. In the digital age, word of mouth didn't mean a hushed conversation at the pub or a whispered warning over a pint. No, in the era of mephedrone, it was all about pixels, likes, and the strangely reassuring anonymity of the internet. At any hour, on any day, you could log on and instantly join a worldwide roundtable of clubbers, would-be chemists, and the kind of self-appointed experts who, a decade earlier, would have been confined to the back corner of the record shop. On YouTube, unboxing videos reached new heights of weirdness. Instead of gadgets or sneakers, people recorded themselves opening suspiciously nondescript envelopes, carefully displaying bags labeled plant food or bath salts, all the while insisting, "This is for research purposes only." The comments section, as always, became a wild west of advice, bravado, and one guy desperately warning, "Don't take more than 20-50 grams unless you want to see God's filing cabinet." Reddit was the real laboratory. In subreddits devoted to research chemicals, threads exploded with minute-by-minute accounts of every possible reaction. Just bombed 100 grams, feeling tingly, might try to vacuum my curtains. 10 minutes later, heart's racing, jaw won't stop, this is awesome. And an hour after that, regret, send memes. Each trip report read like a choose-your-own-adventure novel, complete with warnings about the come-down and a mandatory reminder to stay hydrated, guys. Meanwhile, Facebook group chats and status updates became virtual confessionals. Anyone know a reliable source? Was as common as who's going out tonight? People shared horror stories, success stories, and everything in between. The digital grapevine was fast, messy, and absolutely essential. Before you'd even placed an order, you'd already read 50 accounts from strangers with usernames like MDMA Viking and Buzzed Basilisk. What emerged was a strange, crowdsourced guidebook to surviving the Meow Meow era. Want to know which batches burned your nose? Which head shops shipped discreetly? Which doses to avoid if you wanted to retain your ability to blink? There was a thread for that, a spreadsheet for that, even a Google Doc for that. People posted color, texture, and even taste comparisons. "This week's batch is lemony," someone would write, followed by "mine tastes like sadness and drywall." But social media wasn't just about advice, it was about spectacle. Viral posts and meme pages thrived on the absurdities of mephedrone culture. Pictures of starter packs, Vicks inhaler, sunglasses, a bottle of water, and a rapidly deteriorating sense of self-preservation made the rounds, and jokes about Meow Meow's energizing effects kept everyone laughing, even when the laughter sounded a little nervous. Tweets documented the bizarre. At the club, just saw a guy hug the speaker for 20 minutes. Thanks, Meow Meow. Inevitably, the digital age also accelerated the panic. For every honest trip report, there was a sensationalized post or video gone viral, Stories of people losing their minds, breaking their teeth, or turning into human glow sticks. News outlets combed forums for the wildest tales and then amplified them, feeding a feedback loop of fascination and alarm. Everyone was an expert, everyone had an opinion, and everyone seemed convinced that the next big disaster or breakthrough was just a click away. The upshot? The legend of Meow Meow spread faster than any public health warning, and certainly faster than any actual scientific study. In the absence of real guidance, the internet became the world's most chaotic advice column, where every update might be the secret to the perfect night, or the reason your friends staged an intervention. Looking back, it's almost poetic. In the wild west of digital word of mouth, mephedrone's rise and fall was shaped as much by social media as by chemistry. Reputations were made and ruined in group chats, memes, and frantic status updates. And somewhere in the chaos, everyone agreed on just one thing. Next time, someone else can go first. For a few hours, everything was wonderful. And then, sometimes abruptly, everything was not. From jaw tension to existential dread, the side effects list read like a choose-your-own-adventure in bad decisions. Let's start at the top. The opening act was almost always pure magic. You felt alive, invincible, and most dangerously, endlessly chatty. Meow Meow's first wave sent users into fits of giggles, hugs, and a sudden need to tell their deepest secrets to a houseplant or anyone passing by. You could declare your undying love for the taxi driver, start a group therapy session in the queue for the kebab shop, or explain at length how your new understanding of the universe hinged on the rhythm of club anthems from 1999. But just behind the euphoria lurked chaos. One of mephedrone's signature moves was jaw clenching so intense it sounded like a tap dancer was trapped inside your head. This was swiftly followed by the infamous chewing your face phase, grinding teeth, pursed lips, and a new respect for the durability of human molars. Water bottles and chewing gum became party essentials, as did panicked group chats about how to stop your jaw from doing that thing. The empathy, meanwhile, was both a blessing and a curse. You might find yourself comforting a stranger in the smoking area, discussing childhood traumas with someone you met 4 minutes ago, or forgiving your ex for every slight, real or imagined. Meow Meow turned social awkwardness into a team sport. 1 minute you're dancing with abandon, the next you're locked in a 45-minute conversation about the philosophy of socks. Then came the less poetic effects. Sweat poured off you in buckets, regardless of temperature or effort. Under mephedrone's influence, dance floors became swamps, and even standing still was a slippery ordeal. Clothes clung, hair matted, and the prospect of ever feeling dry again seemed as remote as the promise of sleep, which, by the way, was another casualty. Insomnia hit hard and fast. The sun would rise, birds would sing, and you'd still be lying in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling and questioning every life choice since that just one more line 4 hours ago. But wait, there's more. Palpitations were common, your heart thumping along to a beat only you could hear. Some described feeling like they'd swallowed a marching band. Then came the dreaded come down, the dark twin to all that earlier euphoria. Anxiety, irritability, and a creeping sense of doom settled in. The world, which had been so sparkly and full of potential, now looked gray, unfriendly, and in urgent need of a duvet and a week off work. Physically, things got weirder still. Fingers tingled. Limbs felt rubbery. Noses burned. Sinuses rebelled. And dehydration set in like a tax collector with a grudge. Some users developed rashes, strange itches, or the haunting realization that no amount of lip balm would ever be enough. Appetite disappeared entirely until, at about 7 a.m., it returned with the subtlety of a stampede, and you found yourself trying to eat cold chips with a mouth that barely worked. And then, of course, there were the psychological side effects. Paranoia, moments of existential dread, and a tendency to see patterns in wallpaper that definitely weren't there before. Some people swore they had epiphanies, only to discover later that their notebook was filled with illegible scrawlings and an extended meditation on the meaning of wibble. In short, Meow Meow promised the best night of your life and occasionally delivered the weirdest. The side effects were legendary, sometimes hilarious, sometimes harrowing, always unpredictable. And as anyone who's tried to get to sleep after a big night knows, nothing kills euphoria faster than the realization you have work in 2 hours and your jaw may never unclench again. Politicians, never ones to pass up a good panic, swung into action. New laws, emergency schedules, and frantic press conferences ensued. Unfortunately, every attempt to ban Meow Meow was met with new, slightly tweaked chemicals. The game of cat and mouse began. If there's one thing history teaches us, it's that nothing motivates a government quite like the phrase epidemic among our youth. And as soon as Meow Meow started appearing in hospital reports and newspaper headlines, officials decided the party was over. What followed was a frenzy of hastily written legislation, late-night parliamentary debates, and public service announcements so dramatic they made anti-piracy warnings look like bedtime stories. The first step, emergency scheduling. Governments across Europe, then farther afield, started adding mephedrone to lists of banned substances, sometimes overnight, sometimes with all the ceremony of a witch trial. News anchors wore their gravest expressions as they announced, "From midnight tonight, the so-called legal high will be illegal." The effect was instant. Head shops purged their shelves. Websites went dark. Your local plant food suppliers suddenly switched to selling suspiciously overpriced incense. But outlawing mephedrone was like plugging one hole in a sieve. Chemists, those tireless innovators, simply went back to their molecular drawing boards and produced a new wave of designer drugs. By changing a single atom here, a methyl group there, they'd invented something technically legal and essentially identical to the original. The authorities were always one step behind, like a substitute teacher chasing a class of caffeinated toddlers. The result? The market didn't dry up. It diversified. Every time a new law came in, a new variant hit the streets. Soon partygoers were swapping tales of NRG1, MDAI, and alphabet soup, so confusing even the most seasoned users had to consult flowcharts. Police officers, doctors, and even drug dealers started carrying cheat sheets just to keep up. Politicians responded with the only tool they truly love: more legislation. Blanket bans and catch-all clauses tried to stop entire families of chemicals at once. But even then, enforcement lagged. Labs in China, Eastern Europe, and the UK churned out new concoctions, shipping them faster than customs could update their list of suspicious packages. For a while, the streets became a kind of chemistry fair, with substances that sounded more like Wi-Fi passwords than party drugs. Meanwhile, every crackdown produced its own set of unintended consequences. The black market thrived. The quality and purity of what was being sold plummeted. Now, instead of buying something with a few years of anecdotal evidence behind it, people rolled the dice on substances with names like Benzo Fury or Ivory Wave, each promising legal loopholes and delivering their own brand of chaos. Emergency rooms braced themselves for new and exciting forms of delirium. Through it all, the media was right there, breathlessly reporting every twist and turn. For every victory against drugs, there was a new story about dangerous new highs. One seemed to know if things were getting better or worse, only that the cycle never really stopped. And while the laws did eventually slow the Meow Meow flood, they didn't stop the tide, just redirected it down stranger, less predictable tributaries. For users, it was whiplash. One day you could buy a packet in a shop. The next, you were committing a crime. The landscape changed overnight, turning casual users into accidental outlaws and making everyone wonder, if the law can't keep up, does it even matter? In the end, the battle to ban Meow Meow became a masterclass in legislative improvisation and unintended consequences. The harder the law tried to catch up, the faster the world of synthetic drugs evolved. And as always, the real winners were the chemists, the dealers, and the small, tired group of lawmakers who learned that banning the unbannable means running a race where the finish line never stays in one place. What goes up must come down, and Meow Meow made sure the descent was dramatic. Days blurred, sleep evaporated, and many began to wonder if that plant fertilizer label was, in fact, an omen. The morning after a night with mephedrone was never gentle. There's a special kind of tired that comes from dancing on synthetic wings, and it's not the kind a double espresso or a heroic breakfast can fix. The crash didn't just creep up on you, it marched in, kicked off its boots, and made itself at home. Where last night you were the philosopher king of the kitchen rave. This morning you're a sweaty ghost in a dressing gown, staring at your reflection with the haunted eyes of a person who's just realized their only accomplishment is surviving the night. Sleep, of course, was a distant memory. Meow Meow was notorious for turning insomnia from a vague inconvenience into a personal vendetta. You'd lie in bed, every muscle twitching, eyes wide open, brain replaying the same 3 Club anthems and random, slightly embarrassing conversations on a loop. Every time you thought you might drift off, your heart would remind you it still had some unnecessary racing to do, just in case you'd forgotten who was boss. But the real star of the aftermath was regret. It arrived early, stayed late, and brought its friends. Anxiety, irritability, and a sudden, crushing awareness of every unwashed dish and every unread text you sent to your ex at 4 a.m. Social media only made things worse. What seemed profound or hilarious at 2 a.m. usually looked like the ramblings of a sleep-deprived squirrel by noon. Some people described a come-down so intense it felt like your brain was running an audit on every questionable decision you'd ever made. The guilt, the shame, the existential dread, they all joined the party. Physically, things weren't much better. Your mouth felt like you'd been eating sand, your jaw ached, and your stomach churned at the thought of anything more complex than water and dry toast. Some people got migraines. Others experienced an intense, jittery restlessness that made even sitting still a struggle. You'd pace from room to room, forgetting why you went there, driven by some half-remembered urge to do something, anything. Maybe reorganize the spice rack. Maybe just stare into the fridge and sigh. The withdrawal could last for days. As the initial haze faded, a deeper, more insidious exhaustion took its place. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by sweats and strange looping dreams where nothing quite made sense. Appetite might vanish completely or swing violently in the other direction, sending you on a desperate quest for chips, toast, or anything with salt. The lucky ones bounced back in a day or two. For others, the gray cloud hung around, coloring everything with a sense that the fun had come and gone, leaving only a big pile of nothing in its place. Worse, there was no roadmap for what was happening to your body or mind. Unlike alcohol or weed, mephedrone was new territory. Doctors were still figuring out what to expect. Most advice online amounted to drink water, get rest, and maybe don't do that again. But in the club culture that surrounded Meow Meow, never again was often code for until next weekend. The cycle of binge, crash, and regret became a familiar routine, a weird kind of badge of honor, or at least a shared joke among those who'd seen the sunrise from both sides of the experience. And then there was the search for sleep, a mission that could feel more elusive than any club high. People swapped tips like desperate insomniacs in a support group. Hot showers, warm milk, meditative breathing, blackout curtains, even sleeping pills, which were sometimes less effective than just sheer exhaustion. For many, nothing worked except time. A long, slow slide back into normality, marked by the gradual return of appetite, patience, and finally, the ability to nap without being ambushed by anxiety. In the end, the aftermath of Meow Meow was a warning written in headaches and heartbeats. What lifts you up will always let you down. And the higher you fly, the longer it takes to fall asleep afterward. If you're lucky, you'll learn something in the process. If not, at least you'll have a few cautionary tales for the next generation of party philosophers. And maybe, just maybe, a new appreciation for the humble pleasures of a boring night in and an early bedtime. Once banned, Meow Meow slipped from the legit market into the hands of street dealers, bringing a new set of dangers, prices, and stories no parent wanted to hear at the breakfast table. For a brief, shining moment, anyone with a Wi-Fi connection and a fondness for plausible deniability could buy mephedrone online, delivered in a discreet envelope, complete with hilarious disclaimers about plant nutrition. But when the law finally clamped down, the golden age of internet plant food ended overnight. Gone were the friendly websites, the easy-to-read product, reviews, and the strange thrill of tracking your illicit parcel as it crossed international borders. Now, if you wanted Meow Meow, you had to brave the wilds of the street, where nothing was labeled, everything was more expensive, and the only customer support was a shrug and a don't ask questions. Street dealers, for their part, adapted with the speed and enthusiasm of a sales team on Black Friday. One day, they were pushing weed and knockoff cigarettes. The next, they were the self-declared experts on a drug they couldn't pronounce and had never tried. Overnight, "Do you want skunk?" became "Got any meow?" And if you didn't know the right lingo, you risked ending up with something entirely different, like a headache in a baggie, or, if you were really unlucky, some sodium bicarbonate at a premium price. The risks multiplied, where the internet at least provided a weird veneer of consistency, even if that consistency was, at best, questionable. The street market offered none. Purity went out the window. What was advertised as mephedrone could easily be a random mix of powders, fillers, and possibly whatever happened to be left on the kitchen counter that morning. Some batches were turbocharged. Others did nothing but inspire regret and an urgent trip to the toilet. Every transaction became a gamble with stakes ranging from no effect to see you in A&E. Gone, too, was the convenience. Buying online was as simple as entering your postcode and waiting for the doorbell. Buying on the street meant texts from burner phones, meetups in poorly lit parking lots, and the constant risk of bumping into a neighbor, or worse, your mom's friend from Pilates. There was a new, unwelcome tension to the whole affair, a constant low-level paranoia that the next knock on the door could be the police, or your dealer, or both. And let's not forget the economics. The street market is never kind to the wallet. With the official supply cut off, prices shot up. What once cost a few quid online was now triple the price in cash, with a side of anxiety. Bargain hunters were left out in the cold, while the rest resigned themselves to paying for the privilege of nostalgia and increasingly questionable highs. Nobody ever wrote a glowing online review about the value for money after the ban. Parents, predictably, were horrified. It was one thing to worry about an online shopping spree gone wrong. It was quite another to picture your teenager slipping out at midnight to negotiate with a man named Big Dave, who kept his product in an empty, crisp tin. The news filled with stories of tainted batches, overdoses, and unlucky souls who learned the hard way that street meow was an entirely different beast. The culture changed too. What was once open, if not exactly respectable, became secretive. The inside jokes about plant food faded, replaced by nervous glances and fewer stories shared on social media. It was hard to laugh about a night gone wrong when the stakes were so much higher, and the consequences could be more than a bad come-down. And yet, for all the extra danger and drama, the demand persisted. The party didn't end, it just moved underground. Users swapped tips on which dealers were least dodgy, which batches might actually be the real thing, and how to spot when you'd been ripped off. The stories got darker, the risks greater, and the sense of fun, so bright at the start, faded under the harsh neon lights of the underground scene. In the end, the ban on Meow Meow was less an ending and more a pivot. The internet era closed and the street era began, grittier, riskier, and with none of the comedic packaging. Because if there's one lesson history keeps teaching us, it's that outlawing a drug doesn't erase the demand. It just changes where and how the story gets told. Banning mephedrone didn't end the party. It just invited a parade of new, barely tested chemicals. Synthetic cathinones became the new black, with names no one could pronounce, but everyone was willing to try. If history is a cycle of whack-a-mole, the story of synthetic drugs is a masterclass. The moment authorities closed the door on Meow Meow, 1,000 windows flung open in clandestine labs across the world. Chemists, both entrepreneurial and slightly bored, dusted off their textbooks and started tweaking formulas, sometimes by as little as a single atom, birthing a whole new generation of legal highs that sounded more like alien species than party favors. The new lineup was dazzlingly confusing. Methylone, butylone, pentalone. If it ended in one, you could probably buy it online. There was mephedrone, which was somehow both weaker and more unpredictable, and MDPV, which offered all the chaos of mephedrone with the added bonus of making you believe your own shadow was a police officer. The names came faster than authorities could print warning posters. Benzo Fury, Ivory Wave, NRG1, NRG2, and the deeply suspicious NRG3 all hit the market in quick succession, each promising the same euphoric highs, but bringing along a unique set of side effects, dosage disasters, and emergency room cameos. The process was simple. If you ban a molecule, change a little bit of it, slap a new label on the packet, and voila! It was legal again, at least until someone in Parliament figured out what was happening, by which time the next variant was already en route. This created a surreal situation where lawmakers spent their evenings reading chemistry textbooks, and clubbers spent theirs cross-referencing user reports to figure out what they'd actually ingested. But this chemical arms race had a darker edge. With each new iteration, the safety net got thinner. Mephedrone was, at the very least, somewhat understood. People knew what a typical dose looked like, what the come-down might bring, and roughly how not to ruin their next day at work. The new substances? Pure guesswork. Some batches were so potent that one wrong line could turn a dance floor into a scene from a horror movie. Others did next to nothing, except, perhaps, empty your bank account and shatter your faith in online reviews. The thrill of the new became its own draw. People would swap samples at parties like baseball cards, each claiming to have found the next big thing. This one's like mephedrone, but more chilled, someone would say, right before disappearing into the garden to talk to a bush for 3 hours. For every breakthrough, there were stories of paranoia, hallucinations, or simply being awake for so long you started to question the existence of time itself. And so, the scene became more chaotic, and frankly, more dangerous. The original Meow Meow era felt almost quaint in comparison, a time of innocence before the flood of bath salts and research chemicals that would dominate the next wave of club culture. Emergency rooms grew used to seeing patients who couldn't explain what they'd taken. Doctors had to improvise, treating symptoms without knowing the substance. Meanwhile, online forums filled with warnings, horror stories, and the occasional user who emerged, blinking, from a 3-day binge with nothing but an empty packet and a renewed appreciation for silence. Lawmakers responded the only way they knew how: more blanket bans, broader definitions, and a regulatory net so wide it sometimes snared harmless substances like baking soda and incense sticks. But chemists, ever nimble, just kept moving the goalposts, confident that curiosity, commerce, and the eternal quest for novelty would keep business booming. In the end, the chemistry arms race proved one thing: when it comes to human ingenuity and the desire for a legal high, there is no finish line, only the next molecule, the next packet, and the next adventure into the unknown. And in this new world of synthetic cathinones, the real lesson was clear. If you don't know what's in the bag, you definitely don't know what's coming next. Teen eats. Neighbor's cat after Meow Meow binge was not a real headline, but you'd be forgiven for thinking it was. The media's love affair with hyperbole reached new heights, and public confusion became the norm. Every era of moral panic comes with its own wild folklore, but the Meow Meow years truly pushed the boundaries. The tabloids, already skilled at transforming a minor hiccup into a national crisis, found a goldmine in the baffling world of synthetic drugs. It didn't matter that facts were hard to come by. If anything, that only made the stories more outrageous. Teenager climbs lamppost, sings to pigeons for 4 hours, blared one report. Party drug turns boys into brawling zombies, claimed another, complete with a stock photo of a sulking teen who looked more hungover than undead. You had to laugh, otherwise, you'd have to admit just how bewildered everyone seemed. Parents, teachers, and even police officers were soon trading stories that sounded like deleted scenes from a horror film. There was the urban legend of the lad who, after a wild night, decided to fight a vending machine for staring at him funny. Or the girl who allegedly tried to snort flour after running out of Meow Meow, spending the next morning attempting to explain her sudden passion for baking. Daytime television, never one to shy away from a spectacle, seized on every rumor and inflated it to mythic proportions. Experts with dubious credentials popped up, claiming that Meow Meow was responsible for everything from failed exams to the breakdown of civilized society. One memorable segment featured a roundtable debate on whether the drug could actually make you forget your own name, which in fairness probably did happen, though mostly because people were sleep-deprived, dehydrated, and possibly wearing 3 pairs of sunglasses at once. No story was too weird for the news cycle. There were reports of teenagers losing their minds, running barefoot down the motorway, or developing the strength of 10 men. One rumor insisted that Meow Meow gave people the power to see through walls, which, for a generation raised on superhero movies, probably sounded more like a feature than a bug. The real casualties in all this were the facts. Each new myth made it harder for anyone, users, parents, or policymakers to separate genuine risks from tabloid nonsense. Hospitals had to issue statements clarifying that, no, they hadn't seen a wave of face-melting incidents. Police spokespeople pleaded with the public to focus on actual safety, not urban legends about nocturnal, mephedrone-fueled raccoon gangs. Online forums, of course, joined in the fun. Reddit threads dissected every new rumor with deadpan wit. Did Meow Meow turn my cousin into a werewolf? He's always been hairy, but this seems extreme. Memes popped up overnight, lampooning the panic. A cat wearing sunglasses, a teenage mutant research chemist, or the infamous Breaking Bad in a bedsit scenario. The inside joke was clear: if you believed the headlines, nobody was safe, and your neighbor's garden gnome might be next. For every wild story, there were hundreds of ordinary nights, just people looking for a thrill, a laugh, or a new experience. But the legend stuck. Decades later, someone will still whisper about that time so-and-so tried to eat a traffic cone, or the girl who fell in love with a disco ball. These tales became a kind of folklore, a way for everyone to process the chaos, confusion, and occasional hilarity of a time when nobody quite knew what was happening, but everyone had an opinion. In the end, the craziest urban myths were less a warning than a mirror. Proof that, faced with the unknown, we're as likely to tell ghost stories as we are to seek the truth. And if the tabloids taught us anything, it's that in the battle between panic and reason, never underestimate the power of a good headline, especially if it involves a cat, a club, and a drug nobody can pronounce. Emergency. Rooms braced for a wave of sweaty, hyperactive partygoers, each one convinced their heart was about to burst. Or worse, that they'd be grounded for life if their parents found out. Imagine being a nurse at A&E in 2010. You've handled your fair share of chaos, rugby injuries, spilled kebabs, the occasional "I slipped and fell on it" mystery. But suddenly, there's a new weekend regular, a parade of young people who look like they've run a marathon through a rainstorm, pupils wide as saucers, describing a night out that somehow involved hugging strangers, rearranging traffic cones, and the overwhelming urge to vacuum their bedroom at 4 in the morning. The chief complaint? I think I'm dying. The real issue? I tried something called Meow Meow. No, I don't have a cat. For the medical staff, it was a crash course in the weird, wild world of synthetic drugs. With mephedrone, the symptoms were as dramatic as they were unpredictable. Heart racing? Check. Blood pressure? Through the roof? Absolutely. Sweating enough to make a sauna jealous? Par for the course. There were muscle tremors, bouts of paranoia, teeth chattering, and endless, anxious chatter. Some patients arrived with friends who were equally high, on nerves if not chemicals, while others were dropped off by a taxi driver who refused to accept payment in glow sticks. The fun didn't stop at the hospital door. Call centers and poison hotlines reported a surge in panicked midnight conversations. Is it normal to feel like I've forgotten how to blink? Will I ever sleep again? Can you overdose on empathy? The questions were often bizarre, sometimes heartbreaking, and always urgent. Parents, awakened by frantic phone calls, did their best to keep calm as they searched for symptoms online, only to be greeted by a wall of contradictory advice and inevitably a few tabloid horror stories. Doctors and paramedics found themselves improvising. There were no textbook cases or tried-and-true protocols. Mephedrone was too new, too mysterious, and changed from batch to batch like a chemical chameleon. So, first responders fell back on the basics. Monitor the heart, calm the patient, keep fluids flowing, and most importantly, resist the urge to ask why anyone would willingly ingest something labeled not for human consumption. If a case was particularly severe, things got dramatic. Heart rates that wouldn't slow down, fevers that spiked without warning, or panic attacks so intense the patient was convinced they'd become a permanent part of the hospital furniture. Occasionally, someone would pass out, sending an already anxious room into full-on crisis mode. But most walked, or stumbled, out with a prescription for rest, water, and a strong suggestion to maybe consider chess as a new hobby. Through it all, there was a sense of surreal camaraderie among medical staff. War stories were swapped during night shifts. Remember that guy who tried to eat his own shoe? How about the girl convinced the defibrillator was singing to her? The staff learned to spot Meow Meow cases by sight, clammy, restless, eyes darting, and an aura of regret that lingered long after discharge. But beneath the jokes, the worry was real. The sheer unpredictability of mephedrone and its chemical cousins kept everyone on edge. The lack of consistent purity meant side effects ranged from mild dehydration to terrifying cardiac symptoms. Sometimes patients were back the next week, sheepish and a little wiser. Sometimes they weren't so lucky. As the legal landscape changed, the cases didn't vanish, they just evolved. First responders started seeing newer, even stranger drugs. Each brought its own learning curve and fresh wave of anxious patients. For a while, though, Meow Meow was the word on every medic's lips, a test of patience, skill, and the ability to maintain a straight face in the face of absurdity. In the end, emergency rooms became the unlikely chroniclers of the Meow era. Behind every dramatic story was a real human, seeking comfort, reassurance, or just the answer to the eternal question, am I going to be okay? And if they were lucky, the answer was yes, with a side of life lessons and, hopefully, a very long nap. As governments played whack-a-mole with chemical formulas, public health experts begged for sensible policy. Instead, they got panicked press releases, and for a time, a war on Meow Meow. From the moment Meow Meow hit the headlines, politicians everywhere raced to show that they were tough on drugs. Unfortunately, being tough often meant being reactive, and occasionally, being a little bit ridiculous. Laws were drafted overnight, sound bites rehearsed for the morning news, and government ministers practiced looking stern while pronouncing mephedrone as if it were an ancient curse. The public wanted answers. The press wanted drama. what they all got was confusion. The problem was banning a single chemical didn't make the issue disappear, it just made it mutate. Every time mephedrone or its latest cousin was outlawed, a new, slightly different molecule popped up in its place. For drug chemists, it was less a setback and more an invitation. If mephedrone was now a Schedule I substance, well, what about methylone, or butylone, or the mysterious NRG blends? Each new ban just shifted the goalposts and kept the party rolling, with only the labels and the risks changing. Public health experts looked on in horror. They pleaded for thoughtful, evidence-based policy. Maybe, they suggested, it was time to think bigger, regulate the whole class of synthetic cathinones, or, better yet, focus on harm reduction and education. Maybe, just maybe, putting all your hope in blanket bans and scare tactics wasn't going to work. But the tide of panic was hard to fight. There were votes to be won, and nothing says vote for me like promising to keep kids safe from the latest chemical bogeyman. Meanwhile, resources for actual support lagged behind. Addiction services were swamped, underfunded, and often unprepared to handle the unique challenges of legal highs. Hotlines fielded calls from anxious users and panicked parents. Hospitals braced themselves for the unpredictable symptoms of whatever the latest not for human consumption powder was this week. Instead of clear information, the public got a patchwork of rumors, half-truths, and finger-wagging news reports. Perhaps the greatest policy failure was the missed opportunity to educate. Meow Meow's legal status lulled many into a false sense of security. If it's not banned, how bad can it be? But instead of launching honest, practical public health campaigns about the risks of synthetic drugs, officials stuck with the old playbook. Posters screamed, "Just say no," while actual advice on dosage, hydration, or what to do in an emergency was nearly impossible to find. Young people turned to forums and group chats for guidance, swapping harm reduction tips, because no one in authority would provide them. The war on Meow Meow was always more about optics than outcomes. Police conducted raids, seized powders, and posed with baggies for the press. Lawmakers held committee meetings, then went back to the drawing board as soon as the next new chemical appeared on the market. Each side blamed the other for the continued surge in use. Parents blamed schools, schools blamed politicians, politicians blamed everyone except their own policies. And so, Meow Meow's era became a case study in how not to handle a drug panic. By the time the dust settled, the market had already moved on. Other chemicals, new risks, and more elaborate marketing schemes emerged. The lesson, if anyone was listening, was clear. You can't legislate away curiosity, and you definitely can't outpace the internet. In the end, the real victims were the people left behind. The users, the parents, the overwhelmed medical staff. Sensible policy would have meant clear information, support services, and a willingness to admit that no one-size-fits-all solution exists. Instead, what they got was a patchwork of bans, a wave of panic, and a lingering sense that, when it comes to drug policy, history is doomed to repeat itself, usually with more paperwork, more headlines, and, inevitably, more substances nobody knows how to pronounce. Meow Meow entered the public lexicon, immortalized in questionable pop songs, viral memes, and the kind of inside jokes you only understand if you were there, and hopefully you've since recovered. There are some eras that get their own soundtrack, and the Meow Meow years were no exception. Club anthems with suspiciously energetic lyrics echoed through the speakers of student parties and sticky-floored nightclubs, with at least one unofficial track simply called Plant Food making the rounds on YouTube. DJs were quick to catch on, working sly references into sets, winking at anyone in the crowd who'd ever bought a vacuum-sealed envelope and wondered if their begonias would ever actually flower. But it wasn't just music. Meow Meow became a punchline, a secret handshake for a generation that survived the whiplash between legal high and legislative whack-a-mole. Twitter and Facebook filled up with memes, a cartoon cat with spinning eyes, a dancing packet of bath salts, or a tragicomic flowchart titled, "Should I try Meow Meow?" Spoiler, the answer was always, maybe just go to bed. The memes offered catharsis. If you'd ever spent 6 a.m. counting your own heartbeats or explaining to your housemate why you'd reorganize their sock drawer by color and existential worth, you could laugh and cringe along with everyone else. The real cultural moment, though, happened in the wilds of group chats and late-night conversations. There were the stories, half-true, half-urban legend, of that one epic night when someone declared themselves lord of the kebab queue, or the friend who made a grand speech to a lamppost because it was the only one who really understood. The phrase "meow meow face" entered everyday slang, describing that particular wide-eyed, slightly confused expression that meant someone was either on the come-down or just realized they'd left their shoes at the last party. Inside jokes flourished. A club night flyer promising flower power, bring your own plant food, was an immediate sellout. One particularly infamous meme depicted a starter pack, chewing gum, a cheap scale, sunglasses for the walk of shame home, and a screenshot of a panic-stricken group chat from 4:37 a.m. The cultural impact wasn't just in the headlines or the statistics, but in the lived experience, the knowing glances exchanged on public transport the next day, the coded language for parents, just gardening mum, and the awkward laughter when someone found an empty baggie in last winter's coat. Of course, every cultural phenomenon has its forgotten heroes. Meow Meow was no different. The era produced its own cast of unlikely legends. The one friend who always had bottled water and snacks, the club bathroom attendant who handed out tissues and quiet wisdom, the harm reduction volunteers who quietly posted testing tips and warnings online, helping keep people a little safer when the rest of the world was busy panicking. Even now, the echoes remain. The story of Meow Meow became a cautionary tale, told with a wink, a wince, and a little pride. It was proof that a generation could face chaos and confusion and come out the other side with stories to tell and a brand new respect for hydration. Old memes still circulate whenever the topic comes up, and the phrase, "it's not for human consumption," is trotted out at every reunion, usually followed by laughter and a round of never again. No, seriously. The legacy of Meow Meow isn't just one of panic or regret. It's about creativity, resilience, and the way culture absorbs even the strangest trends and turns them into folklore. It's the reason a whole generation of clubbers can still make eye contact in the harsh light of morning and know, without a word, that sometimes surviving the night is its own kind of victory. And if you still have the playlist from that era hidden somewhere on your phone, well, maybe just listen on a quiet evening with the lights low and a big glass of water close by. For every horror story, there were tales of bizarre self-discovery, wild nights, and the slow realization that maybe, just maybe, this was not the healthiest hobby. It's easy to get lost in the headlines and the moral panics, but behind every packet of Meow Meow was a real person, someone with a story to tell that didn't always fit into the neat little boxes of victim or villain. There was the university student who'd never so much as jaywalked before, but one night, after hearing rave reviews in a group chat, decided to give plant food a whirl. The next morning, she'd written half of their novel, alphabetized her wardrobe, and discovered a deep spiritual connection with her desk lamp. I'd never felt so alive, she admitted later, or so in need of a long shower and a nap. Others chased the highs until they ran straight into the lows. There was the seasoned clubber who thought he'd seen it all, only to discover that mephedrone's afterglow could turn to existential gloom at the speed of light. One Friday, he was the life of the party, cracking jokes, hugging strangers, convinced he'd solved the secret to happiness. By Sunday, he was a shivering burrito on the couch, texting apologies for things he barely remembered and swearing off all things not for human consumption. The lesson? Sometimes the greatest revelations come after the worst decisions. Then there were the groups of friends who bonded over their adventures, sharing baggies, wild ideas, and the kind of memories that linger long after the come down. They became self-appointed harm reductionists, inventing rituals, always have water, never dose alone, and don't trust anyone who says, this batch is different. For some, the journey was an initiation into adulthood, a chaotic, exhilarating chapter that ended with a healthy respect for limits and a list of never-again stories to be trotted out at every reunion. Of course, not all stories had happy endings. There were the scares, heart palpitations that sent people running to A&E, nights spent sweating through sheets and wondering if the label had been right all along, not for human consumption. One user recounted how a small line turned into hours of panic, culminating in a frantic call to his mom and a vow to take up knitting instead. I learned my lesson, he said, and my scarf collection has never looked better. But the strangest lessons came not from disaster, but from those quiet, in-between moments, lying awake at dawn, realizing you'd spent the night dancing with your own shadow, or finding a sudden empathy for people you'd barely noticed before. Meow Meow, in all its unpredictable glory, had a way of cracking open the usual routine. Some users found themselves rethinking friendships, priorities, or just how much joy there was in a simple glass of water and a full night's sleep. In every corner of the scene, there were would-be philosophers and accidental comedians. Someone would always try to explain the meaning of life, usually just before sunrise, often while sitting on a kitchen floor. Others, a little wiser, simply nodded along, understanding that some experiences are best left unexamined. You had to be there became the rallying cry, a shorthand for the wild ride from euphoria to regret and all the awkward dancing in between. Looking back, those who survived the Meow Meow era don't just remember the highs or the lows. They remember the lessons nobody really wanted. That moderation is harder than it sounds. That sleep is not optional. That every shortcut has a cost. And sometimes the cost is just a weekend spent eating toast and avoiding eye contact with your own reflection. Most of all, they remember that the best stories come with a twist, a dose of caution, a lot of laughter, and the quiet relief of waking up to a quieter, calmer morning. Once the dust settled, scientists began to study the aftermath. The verdict? Mephedrone was just as unpredictable, addictive, and risky as everyone suspected, but now with charts and graphs to prove it. In the early days, Meow Meow operated in a kind of scientific twilight. No one really knew what it did to the body or mind in the long run, and the most reliable data available was the collective wisdom of clubbers on internet forums and a handful of wild trip reports written in the small hours of the morning. But as emergency rooms filled up and the legal loopholes snapped shut, the white coats finally got their hands on the data, and, as it turned out, reality was just as strange as the urban legends. Researchers found themselves sifting through a pile of clinical notes, self-reported surveys, and police reports that read like the world's weirdest choose-your-own-adventure novel. There were cases of heart palpitations, soaring blood pressure, dehydration, psychosis, and, on the less dramatic end, people simply unable to sleep for days. It was a medical buffet. Anxiety, paranoia, hallucinations, and more jaw tension than a dentist's worst nightmare. But science, unlike the tabloid press, doesn't panic. Methodically, teams around the world started publishing the first serious studies on synthetic cathinones and mephedrone in particular. They mapped out the ways mephedrone worked in the brain, confirming what partygoers already knew. This was a drug that turbocharged dopamine and serotonin, cranking the reward systems up to 11, but leaving behind a mess that could take days or longer to clean up. The studies painted a clear, if sobering, picture. Mephedrone was fast-acting and highly reinforcing, making users want to redose over and over in a single session. Repeated use could lead to strong psychological cravings, classic hallmarks of addiction. Animal studies revealed that mephedrone was just as likely, or even more so, to cause compulsive self-administration than other notorious stimulants. Not that the average rat has ever been to a club, but the lesson was clear. The potential for getting hooked was real. Long-term health risks also began to emerge. There were warnings about damage to the heart and blood vessels, as well as to memory and mental health. Some users developed lasting anxiety, depression, or even psychotic symptoms that lingered long after the last dance was done. Scientists issued new advisories, urging caution and in some cases suggesting that the come down from mephedrone could be more severe and longer lasting than that from MDMA or cocaine. For the first time, those warnings were backed by hard evidence. Brain scans, blood work, and psychological profiles started replacing anecdotes as the main source of information. Instead of trip reports, harm reduction websites now linked to clinical studies and government guidelines. Even so, the gap between science and street was hard to bridge. Many users, long conditioned to distrust authority, preferred the advice of friends and online strangers to the voice of medical professionals. But slowly, public health campaigns got smarter. Leaflets and websites began explaining the risks in plain language, how to spot the signs of overdose, what to do if you can't sleep for 3 nights in a row, and why just a little more was almost never a good idea. Some harm reduction groups even set up mobile testing labs at festivals, offering real-time drug checking and science-based advice. No moralizing, just facts and a bottle of water. Perhaps the greatest lesson was that science doesn't operate on the same timescale as fads. By the time the evidence was in, the Meow Meow party had largely moved on, replaced by a new generation of chemicals and cautionary tales. Still, for everyone who'd ridden the roller coaster, the research provided a kind of belated validation. Yes, it was as wild and as risky as it felt at the time. In the end, the story of mephedrone proved that science is slow but relentless. Myths fade, panic passes, but the data remains, quietly reminding us that what goes up must come down, And there's always a long hangover after a wild night in the chemical unknown. Did society learn its lesson? Did new laws help? Or did they just pave the way for stranger, scarier substances? And is there really such a thing as a safe party drug? Looking back, the Meow Meow era seems almost surreal, a blur of legal highs, moral panics, and midnight deliveries labeled not for human consumption. For a brief time, mephedrone was the star of the party, the favorite of clubbers and curious souls who just wanted something new. Then, as quickly as it arrived, it vanished, banned, demonized, and replaced by an ever-mutating parade of new synthetics. So what, if anything, did we actually learn? First, there's the lesson that chemistry always outruns the law. Every time government scrambled to ban a substance, clever chemists and opportunistic dealers simply tweaked the molecule and kept the supply lines open. By the time one loophole closed, 5 new research chemicals were already on the market, each stranger and less studied than the last. The war on Meow Meow didn't end the party. It just made it more unpredictable and arguably more dangerous. Second, the saga showed how slow, reactive policy and public panic often go hand in hand. Politicians scrambled to appear tough, but by the time emergency laws were enacted, the scene had already moved on. Meanwhile, those actually on the ground, users, medics, harm reduction workers, were left with the fallout. It's a story as old as time. Real progress is slow, subtle, and often overlooked in the glare of headlines about zombie teens and bath salt madness. The real need, it turned out, was for clear information, practical education, and honest conversations, none of which fit neatly into a press conference or a viral meme. Third, the Meow Meow era revealed how powerful word of mouth and online culture had become. While officials and journalists scrambled to keep up, it was users on forums, group chats, and social media who wrote the real survival guides, sharing trip reports, harm reduction tips, and occasionally dire warnings. In a world where science lagged behind the latest chemical, collective knowledge became the safety net. There's also a broader, sobering lesson. There is no truly safe party drug, legal or otherwise. For every story of a great night and a temporary sense of invincibility, there were tales of sleepless regret, hospital visits, and friendships tested by paranoia and panic. Mephedrone's rapid rise and fall is a case study in the dangers of assuming legal equals harmless. The era made many realize that a lack of regulation is not the same as a guarantee of safety. In fact, it often means the opposite. But perhaps the most hopeful lesson is that people adapt. Clubbers and casual users, after the novelty wore off, became more cautious and better informed. Harm reduction grew from the fringes to the mainstream. Festivals, clubs, and even universities began to offer real support, water stations, drug testing, and non-judgmental advice. The culture shifted, quietly, towards looking after each other. Even some politicians eventually got the memo, supporting policies based on facts instead of fear. Still, the legacy of Meow Meow lingers. It's a reminder that for every new drug, there will be a learning curve of panic, confusion, harm, and eventually adaptation. New substances will always tempt the curious and the restless. But with each cycle, society gets a little better at coping, a little quicker to learn, and hopefully a little more honest about what really keeps people safe. So, did we learn anything? Maybe not everything we needed to, but enough to face the next wave with a touch more wisdom, a few more tools, and a healthy skepticism of anything labeled plant food. And if nothing else, we've all earned the right to say, I survived the Meow Meow years, and all I got was this slightly bizarre story and a newfound respect for early nights and moderation. Even as Meow Meow faded from the spotlight, the world of legal highs and research chemicals marched on, always one step ahead of the law and common sense. In the end, the only guarantee is that history, like club nights, repeats itself, usually with worse music. As soon as one miracle molecule was banned, 1,000 new contenders sprang up to take its place, each with a longer name, fewer safety studies, and a marketing plan built around plausible deniability and the thrill of novelty. Mephedrone became just one entry in an ever-growing catalog of party powders and digital-era mysteries. Where once you had to know a dealer, then a website, now all you needed was a group chat and a willingness to believe that surely this next thing would be both legal and safe. But the truth is, the synthetic scene didn't slow down. It just got stranger. Chemists kept tweaking formulas, moving the goalposts just enough to keep regulators scrambling. Soon, bath salts became a catch-all term for an ever-shifting parade of cathinones, each more mysterious and unpredictable than the last. People started comparing notes on message boards about substances like APVP, ethylone, or the one that made everyone believe they could read the microwave's thoughts. Nobody knew what to expect, but everyone was willing to try, at least once. The law, for its part, kept up the frantic dance. Blanket bans, catch-all legislation, and whole families of chemicals blacklisted in bulk. It made things safer in some ways and riskier in others because the black market doesn't care about dosage, purity, or whether your plant food has been tested outside of someone's cousin's garage. Paranoia replaced the brief period of legal invincibility, and cautionary tales multiplied. If Meow Meow was an experiment, the results were clear. Every solution brings new problems, and every crackdown is just a plot twist. For users, the spirit of curiosity never really faded. There was always the hope that the next chemical would deliver the old magic without the new horrors. And as trends cycled, sometimes returning to old favorites, sometimes diving into the unknown, the lessons of the Meow Meow era lingered. Forums and group chats adapted, offering advice for the next round of substances. Always test your batch, always have water, and always make sure at least one person is thinking about breakfast. Meanwhile, the broader world just kept getting weirder. Social media churned out new memes, new music genres appeared, most of them regrettable, and the gee phrase not for human consumption became both a joke and a warning. If there was one silver lining, it was the rise of harm reduction. Organizations sprang up to test substances at festivals. Volunteers handed out honest advice and safe supplies, and even the most hard-headed partygoers started to think twice before diving into the next anonymous powder. Maybe not every time, but enough to prove that people do learn, eventually. And so, as history spun on, Meow Meow's place was secure, not as a one-off disaster, but as a milestone in the endless saga of human ingenuity, risk, and the irresistible urge to push boundaries. Was it the end? Hardly. Just the beginning of another cycle, another substance, another chapter in the world's weirdest science experiment. The only constant was the music, and even that was open to debate. So next time you hear about a new miracle legal high, remember the story of Meow Meow, the laughs, the panic, the lessons, and the eternal, sleep-deprived optimism that next time it'll all work out. And if nothing else, maybe choose the quiet night in. At least you'll remember where you left your shoes. If you've ever wondered what happens when capitalism and chaos collide, look no further than the Meow Meow era. Overnight, everyone from washed-up chemistry majors to enterprising dog groomers became business owners, selling baggies of mystery powder with names like Ivory Wave or Charge A Plus. It was a golden age for anyone who thought the perfect side hustle was just a few shipping labels and a basic understanding of international postal law away. The barriers to entry were almost comically low. Forget business plans, formal pitches, or market research. All you needed was a decent printer, a rudimentary website, and enough nerve to pretend you were in the horticultural supply game. Entrepreneurs popped up faster than festival tents after payday, each with their own homebrew brand and increasingly ridiculous packaging. Bright colors, fake scientific jargon, and cartoon animals wearing sunglasses were the norm, as if the goal was to reassure both your inner child and your inner risk-taker in one go. It wasn't just online either. Head shops and corner stores, desperate for a slice of the legal high pie, began filling their shelves with tiny packets promising everything from aromatic bliss to botanical vitality. Some labels looked like they'd been designed during a lunch break using Microsoft Paint. There were winking warnings, not for human consumption, the world's least convincing disclaimer, followed by a smiley face and maybe a coupon for your next purchase. And yet, the branding was strangely effective. If you'd always dreamed of consuming something called mojo madness or white lightning, this was your moment. The stranger the name, the bigger the draw. Was Ivory Wave a new shampoo, a pirate radio station, or a powder that might send you on a 3-day cleaning spree? Only one way to find out. The more mysterious the product, the greater the sense of adventure and, of course, plausible deniability when the authorities came knocking. The real winners were the opportunists who understood supply and demand better than most economics professors. They'd bulk buy powder from wholesalers in China or Eastern Europe, repackage it into tiny Ziploc bags, and watch the orders roll in. Some even offered next-day delivery for an extra fee, knowing that nothing says urgency like the phrase, "my plants are dying." A few tried to class things up with fake certificates of authenticity or claims that their product was triple lab tested, whatever that meant. With every new headline or law change, the market shifted. Entrepreneurs adapted overnight. A fresh logo here, a new product blend there, maybe a rebrand as bath crystals instead of plant food. If business slowed in the UK, they'd ship to the Netherlands or Australia or wherever the legal loopholes were widest. Some operators became infamous, their brand names whispered in club toilets and online forums as either a badge of honor or a warning. Don't try Blue Monkey, mate. Last time I couldn't feel my teeth for a week. But it wasn't all success stories. For every budding mogul who struck gold, there were countless others who vanished after one batch went wrong, or a custom seizure wiped out their profits. The legal high economy was ruthless, a Darwinian hustle of backstabbing, undercutting, and the occasional heartfelt customer complaint. My happy plant packet was just flour. Refund, please. There were rumors of turf wars between rival kitchen chemists and tales of marketing mishaps so egregious that even the most sleep-deprived partygoers raised an eyebrow. At its core, the Meow Meow marketplace was a microcosm of the internet age. A little brilliance, a lot of recklessness, and more than a dash of absurdity. Capitalism did what capitalism does best: fill every gap, push every boundary, and turn even the strangest fads into gold, at least for a while. The legacy is still visible in the occasional packet of mystery powder on eBay, the faded shop fronts of head shops past, and the wild stories that live on in group chats everywhere. And if you're still wondering who buys something labeled not for human consumption, the answer for a time was almost everyone. Just another reminder that when the rules of the game change, there's always someone ready to sell you a ticket to play. Suddenly, Meow Meow wasn't just the punchline of niche internet jokes, it was leading the news. Stories of legal highs zipped from tabloids in the UK to somber news anchors in Australia, each one trying to pronounce mephedrone like it wasn't just invented by a sleep-deprived club promoter. Public opinion ping-ponged between horror, amusement, and a vague urge to call their children, just in case. The transformation was dizzying. What started as coded whispers on online forums turned into a media-feeding frenzy of global proportions. In the UK, headlines grew more dramatic with every news cycle. Deadly plant food claims. Another victim competed with zombie teens Rome City after Meow Meow binge. Editors raced to outdo each other in hyperbole, and daytime talk shows featured experts solemnly explaining why your child's gardening hobby might be a cover for a burgeoning drug empire. Elsewhere, the reaction was equally frantic and just as confused. In Australia, television news segments adopted their most dramatic lighting and slowest zooms, turning every empty packet of bath salts into the center of a possible crime wave. Parents gathered around the TV, gasping at the suggestion that a bag of white powder ordered online could bring about the end of civilization, or at the very least, the end of restful sleep. Mephedrone's name bounced awkwardly around the world, mangled into mephedrone, mephedrine, and that weird cat stuff from the internet. International press, desperate for stories that would both shock and entertain, seized on every rumor. A teenager dancing on the roof? Must be Meow Meow. An ambulance parked outside a nightclub? Meow Meow strikes again. Public service announcements rolled out, with stern-faced officials warning, "If you don't know what it is, don't take it." A message that, for a generation raised on the internet, landed somewhere between obvious and completely useless. Meanwhile, public opinion flipped back and forth like a caffeinated coin. There was a genuine sense of alarm, sure, especially when real incidents landed people in hospital or worse. But there was also a kind of bemused detachment, a recognition that this was just the latest in a long line of youth panics. Anyone old enough to remember raves, ecstasy, or the satanic panic of the 1980s could spot the pattern. 1 part danger, 2 parts overreaction, and a generous helping of outright fabrication. Social media made the story even harder to contain. Viral. Clips of news anchors bungling the name mephedrone became memes in their own right, shared with the caption, "How do you do, fellow kids?" YouTube filled up with reaction videos, young people mocking the hysteria, parents filming themselves throwing out any bag of fertilizer just in case, and one iconic Australian grandma reading drug warnings and declaring, "In my day, we just had too much sherry." As the months passed, the headlines started to blur together. New substances appeared, old ones faded away, and the relentless march of novelty outpaced every attempt at control. But the impact was lasting. In a strange way, Meow Meow's time in the limelight helped break a taboo. Suddenly, people were talking openly about legal highs, questioning the gap between what was banned and what was merely available, and most importantly, sharing real information alongside the scare stories. Of course, some things never change. The next new drug would follow the same script: mysterious origins, moral, panic, public warnings, and, eventually, tired jokes about how nothing's as strong as it was back in my day. But the brief, bewildering reign of Meow Meow remains a perfect example of how quickly the strange becomes normal, and how yesterday's joke can become tomorrow's lead story, usually with a few extra syllables and a lot more confusion. In the end, as the spotlight faded and the next panic came along, people everywhere were left with one clear lesson. If you want to confuse your parents, terrify the news, and make history, you could do worse than a packet of plant food and a name nobody can pronounce. Law enforcement found themselves playing catch-up in the world's least glamorous relay race. Raids on head shops turned up shelves of not-for-human consumption products and the occasional lava lamp. Training manuals had to be rewritten. Meanwhile, some officers could only shake their heads and mutter, "Back in my day, we just worried about beer." For police forces across the UK and beyond, the rise of Meow Meow was like stepping onto a dance floor where someone kept changing the music every 30 seconds. One day, it was legal to sell a baggie of plant food to a teenager. The next, that same baggie might be illegal, or at least highly suspicious, depending on the latest government circular. It was an enforcement nightmare with all the clarity of a glow-in-the-dark fog machine. The main challenge was the law itself. Most street officers were used to searching for drugs with names they recognized: cannabis, cocaine, ecstasy. Now they were confronted with packets labeled bath salts, research chemicals, or pond cleaner X2000, each promising that, no, really, these were just for the fish. The packaging, all bold fonts and psychedelic graphics, gave nothing away except a deep, abiding disrespect for standard English spelling. And so began the age of confusion. Officers were briefed on a new and constantly shifting list of banned substances, but it often felt like trying to memorize a phone book in a language you'd never studied. One week's top priority was Ivory Wave. By the time the next rota rolled around, it was NRG1, or White Lightning. Seizures mounted, but prosecutions lagged. What, exactly, had they confiscated? Nobody could say for sure, not the shop owners, not the kids buying the stuff, and certainly not the weary cop filling out paperwork by the light of a confiscated disco ball. The raids themselves became surreal. Some head shops, sensing the winds of change, doubled down on plausible deniability. Shelves were stacked with packets marked, "Not for human consumption," "For display only," or, in one memorable case, "Do not snort." Next to the packets, incense burners, crystal pendulums, and of course, an army of glow sticks ready for the next big rave. On slow nights, the evidence room at the police station began to look less like a crime lab and more like the world's most disappointing music festival. Training became an endless game of catch-up. Officers were sent on crash courses in chemistry, taught to spot the difference between methylone, mephedrone, and a box of washing powder. Some learned the hard way after an energetic arrestee explained that what they'd found was, in fact, genuine plant fertilizer for personal use. Skepticism grew, as did a sense of humor. If it glows, confiscate it became the unofficial motto of one night shift. Meanwhile, confusion reigned on the front lines. Parents called the police to ask if it was legal for their child to buy energy powder at the corner shop. Teachers found mysterious sachets in backpacks and had no idea what to write in the incident report. Even club bouncers got involved, sometimes confiscating party favors only to hand them over to bemused police officers, who promptly added them to the growing pile of weirdness in the back office. And yet, for all the panic, most police officers recognized the limits of enforcement. Crackdowns came and went, but the demand never really disappeared. If anything, making mephedrone illegal just pushed the market underground, where quality control vanished and risks multiplied. Some officers began to advocate for a better education and harm reduction, if only to stop having to memorize the chemical family tree every other week. Looking back, the police response to Meow Meow was part theater, part tragedy, and part farce. A moment in history when the law tried to keep up with chemistry and everyone else just tried to keep a straight face. The raids, the paperwork, the glow sticks, none of it could quite stop the party. And in the end, more than one weary officer would say, with a sigh, "You know, beer never caused this much trouble." And so, as the bass fades and the chemical fog lifts, we reach the end of our wild, bewildering journey through the history of Meow Meow, humanity's brief flirtation with legal highs, bad decisions, and truly appalling branding. You made it through the legal loopholes, the tabloid frenzies, and at least 3 different types of existential dread, all from the comfort of your bed. Maybe tonight, as you curl up beneath clean sheets, grateful for the simple pleasure of a silent heart rate and the absence of glow-in-the-dark sweat, you'll spare a thought for those brave, slightly misguided souls who danced too hard and slept too little in the era of Meow Meow. They chased euphoria and ran smack into reality, giving the rest of us a front-row seat to what happens when chemistry, commerce, and curiosity go completely off script. Because history isn't just about kings, queens, and great battles. It's about the ridiculous, messy, and oddly hopeful ways people try to escape the ordinary, even if it means inventing a legal stimulant out of plant food. It's about survival, resilience, and yes, a certain amount of stubborn optimism that next time, maybe this new thing will be the answer. Spoiler, it never is. So as you settle in, listening to the quiet hum of your fan and the soft sounds of modern comfort, maybe whisper a quiet thank you to the scientists, club kids, pharmacists, and yes, even the regulators who finally close the loophole on Meow Meow. Be grateful for your safe, regulated medicines, your boring tap water, and the fact that your worst dance moves are safely contained in your living room. Because history is proof that humans are creative, hopeful, and occasionally, spectacularly, ridiculous. And that, in the end, is why we keep telling these stories. Sleep well, dream easy, and remember, the strangest things are usually the ones we all survive together. Good night.